Settlers by J. Sakai. Chapter 1, Section 2. The Foundations of Settler Life. The life of European settlers, and the class structure of their society, was abnormal because it was dependent upon a foundation of conquests, genocide, and enslavement. The myth of the self-sufficient white settler family clearing the wilderness, and supporting themselves through their own initiative and hard labor, is a propaganda fabrication. It is the absolute characteristic of settler society to be parasitic, dependent upon the super-exploitation of oppressed peoples for its style of life. Never has a Euro-American society completely supported itself. This is the decisive factor in the consciousness of all classes and strata of white society from 1600 to now. Settler society was raised up, above the level of backward old Europe, by a foundation of conquest. This conquest was a miracle drug for a Europe convulsed with the reaction of decaying feudalism and deadly capitalism. Shot into the veins of the Spanish feudal nation, for instance, the miracle drug of New World conquest gave Spain the momentary power to overrun North Africa, Holland, and Italy before her historical instant waned. For the English settlers, this conquest made real the bourgeois vision of building a whole new European society. Like many such, quote, fixes, for Euro-Americans this conquest was addicting. It was habit-forming and rapidly indispensable, not only culturally, but in the mechanism of an oppressor society whose lifeblood was new conquest. We will examine this later, in the relationship of settlerism to imperialism. For now, it is enough to see that this conquest is a material fact of great magnitude, an economic and social event as important as the emergence of the factory system or the exploitation of petroleum in the Middle East. We stress the obvious here because the Euro-American settlers have always made light of their invasion and occupation, although the conquered territory is the precondition for their whole society. Traditionally, European settler societies throw off the propaganda smokescreen that they didn't really conquer and dispossess other nations. They claim with false modesty that they merely moved into vacant territory. So the early English settlers depicted America as empty, quote, a howling wilderness, unsettled, sparsely populated, just waiting with a vacant sign on the door for the first lucky civilization to walk in and claim it. Theodore Roosevelt wrote defensively in 1900, quote, the settler and pioneer have, at bottom, a justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages. End quote. Picture: a map of tribal and cultural areas of North America. It is telling that this lie is precisely the same lie put forward by the white Afrikaner settlers, who claim that South Africa was literally totally uninhabited by any Africans when they arrived from Europe. To universal derision, these European settlers claim to be the only rightful, historic inhabitants of South Africa. Or we can hear similar defenses out forward by the European settlers of Israel, who claim that much of the Palestinian land and buildings they occupy are rightfully theirs, since the Arabs allegedly decided to voluntarily abandon it all during the 1948-49 war. Are these kind of tales any less preposterous when put forward by Euro-American settlers? America was, quote, spacious and, quote, sparsely populated, only because the European invaders destroyed whole civilizations and killed off millions of Native Americans to get the land and profits they wanted. We all know that when the English arrived in Virginia, for example, they encountered an urban, village-dwelling society far more skilled than they in the arts of medicine, agriculture, fishing, and government. Footnote: the first government of the new USA, that of the Articles of the Confederation, was totally unlike any in autocratic Europe, and had been influenced by the government of the Six Nation Iroquois Confederation. End of footnote. This civilization was reflected in a chain of 300 Indian nations and peoples stretched from the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America, many of whom had highly developed societies. There was, in fact, a greater population in these Indian nations in 1492 than in all of Western Europe. Recent scholarly estimates indicate that at the time of Columbus, there were 100 million Indians in the hemisphere, 10 million in North America, 25 million in central Mexico, with an additional 65 million elsewhere in Central and Southern America. These numbers have long been concealed, since they give rise to the logical question of what happened to this great mass of people. The European invaders, Spanish, Dutch, English, Portuguese, and French, simply killed off millions and millions to safeguard their conquest of the land and provide the disposable slave labor they needed to launch their New World. Conservative Western historical estimates show that the Spanish, quote, reduced the Indian population of their colonies from some 50 million to only 4 million by the end of the 17th century. And from the 10 million Indians that once inhabited North America, after 4 centuries of settler invasion and rule, there were, in 1900, perhaps 200 to 300,000 surviving descendants in the USA. That was the very substantial down payment towards the continuing blood price that third world nations have to pay to sustain the Euro-American way of life. So when we hear that the settlers, quote, pushed out the Indians, or forced the Indians to leave their traditional hunting grounds, we know that these are just code phrases to refer politely to the most barbaric genocide imaginable. It could well be the greatest crime in all of human history. Only here, the Adolf Eichmanns and Heinrich Himmlers had names like Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Jackson. The point is, the genocide was not an accident, not an excess, not the unintended side effect of viral European growth. Genocide was the necessary and deliberate act of the capitalists and their settler shock troops. The, quote, final solution to the, quote, Indian problem was so widely expected by whites that it was openly spoken of as a commonplace thing. At the turn of the century, a newspaper as, quote, respectable as the New York Times could editorially threaten that those peoples who opposed the New World capitalist order would, quote, be extinguished like the North American Indian. Only a relative handful of Indians survived the time of the Great Extermination campaigns. You see, the land wasn't empty after all. And for America to exist, the settlers had to deliberately make the land empty. The second aspect of colonial America's foundation was, of course, slavery. It is hardly necessary to repeat here the well-known history of that exploitation. What is necessary is to underline how universally European capitalist life was dependent upon slavery, and how this exploitation dictated the very structure of Euro-American society. A picture of Dutch and English settlers uniting to slaughter the Pequot, 1637. The mythology of the white masses pretends that while the evil planter and the London merchant grew fat on the profits of the slave labor, the "poor white" of the South, the northern small farmer, and white worker were all uninvolved in slavery and benefited not at all from it. The mythology suggests that slavery even lowered the living standard of the white masses by supposedly holding down wages and monopolizing vast tracts of farmland. Thus, it is alleged, slavery was not in the interests of the white masses. Footnote. Similar arguments relative to today are advanced by the "don't divide the working class" revisionists, who want to convince us that the Euro-American masses are victims of imperialism, just like us. End of footnote. Yet Karl Marx observed, quote, "Cause slavery to disappear, and you will have wiped America off the map of nations." End quote. Marx was writing during the zenith of the cotton economy of the mid-1800s. But this most basic fact is true from the bare beginnings of European settlement in America. Without slave labor, there would have been no America. It is as simple as that. Long before the cotton economy of the South flourished, for example, African slaves literally built the city of New York. Their work alone enabled the original Dutch settlers to be fed and sheltered while pursuing their drinking, gambling, fur trading, and other non-laboring activities. Africans were not only much of early New York's farmers, carpenters, and blacksmiths, but also comprised much of the city's guards. The Dutch settlers were so dependent on African labor for the basics of life that their governor finally had to grant some African slaves both freedom and land in return for their continued food production. The African-owned land on Manhattan included what is now known as Greenwich Village, Astor Place, and Herald Square. Later, the English settlers would pass laws against African land ownership and take these tracts from the free Africans. Manhattan was thus twice stolen from oppressed peoples. Indian slavery was also important in supporting the settler invasion beachhead on the New World. From New England, where the pious pilgrims called them, quote, servants, to South Carolina, the forced labor of Indian slaves was essential to the very survival of the young colonies. In fact, the profits from the Indian slave trade were the economic mainstay of the settler invasion of the Carolinas. In 1708, the English settlements in the Carolinas had a population of 1,400 Indian slaves to 2,900 African slaves to 5,300 Europeans. Indian slaves were common throughout the colonies. In 1730, the settlers of Kingston, Rhode Island, had 223 Indian slaves, as well as 333 African slaves. As late in 1740, we know that some 14,000 Indian slaves labored in the plantations of South Carolina. The recorded number of Indian slaves within colonial English settlements was only a small indication of the larger picture, since most Indian slaves were sold to Jamaica, Barbados, and other West Indian colonies. One reason for the depopulation of the once numerous Indian peoples of the southern colonies was the unrestrained ravages of the slave trade. In the first 5 decades of the English settlement of the Carolinas, it appears that the main cash export item was Indian slaves. Armed expeditions, made up largely of Indian puppet soldiers already addicted to rum and other capitalist consumer goods, scoured the countryside for Indians to capture and sell. The total sold away is unknown, but large. We do know that in just 6 years after 1704, some 12,000 Indian slaves were sold out of Charleston to the West Indies. Additional uncounted thousands of Indian slaves were exported from the other settlements of the Middle and New England colonies. Indian slaves in large numbers were very difficult to deal with, since the settlers were trying to hold them on terrain that was more theirs than the invaders. Usually, the minimum precaution would be to, in effect, swap Indian slaves around, with New England using slaves from the southern colonies, and vice versa. In most cases, the slave catchers killed almost all the adult Indian men as too dangerous to keep around, only saving the women and children for sale. But by 1715, the diverse conspiracies, insurrections of rebellious Indian slaves had reached the point where all the New England colonies barred any further imports of Indian slaves. The Pilgrims of New England had seen that the most profitable and safe use of their Indian slaves was to sell them abroad. Indeed, the wife and 9-year-old son of King Philip, the great leader of the 1675 Indian uprising, were sold into West Indian captivity, as was even then customary with many captured Indians. Thus, the early settlers were not just the passive beneficiaries of a far-off African slave trade. They bankrolled their settlements in part with the profits of their own eager explorations into native slave trading. The point is that white America has never been self-sufficient, has never completely supported itself. Indian slavery died out, and was gradually lost in the great river of African slavery, only because the settlers finally decided to exterminate the heavily depopulated Indian nations altogether. The essence is not the individual ownership of slaves, but rather the fact that world capitalism in general, and Euro-American capitalism in specific, had forged a slave-based economy in which all settlers gained and took part. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison, in his study of the European discovery of America, notes that after repeated failures, the Europeans learned that North American settler colonies were not self-sufficient. To survive, they needed large capital infusions and the benefits of sustained trade with Father Europe. But why should the British aristocracy and capitalist invest in small family farms? And how great a trade is possible when what the settlers themselves produced was largely the very raw materials and foodstuffs they themselves needed? Slavery throughout the New World answered these questions. It was the unpaid, expropriated labor of millions of Indian and African captive slaves that created the surpluses on which the settler economy floated and Atlantic trade flourished. So all the sections of white settler society, even the artisan, worker, and farmer, were totally dependent upon African slave labor. The fisherman, whose low-grade refuse fish was dried and sold as slave meal in the Indies. The New York farmer, who found his market for surpluses in the southern plantations. The forester, whose timber was used by shipyard workers, rapidly turning out slave ships. The clerk in the New York City export house, checking bales of tobacco, awaiting shipment to London. The master cooper in the Boston Rum Distillery. The young Virginia overseer building up his stake to try to start his own plantation. The immigrant German farmer renting a team of 5 slaves to get his farm started, and on and on. While the cream of the profits went to the planter and merchant capitalists. The entire settler economy was raised up on a foundation of slave labor, slave products, and the slave trade. Nor was it just slavery within the 13 colonies alone that was essential. The commerce and industry of these Euro-American settlers was interdependent with their fellow slave-owning capitalists of the West Indies, Central, and Southern America. Massachusetts alone, in 1774, distilled 2.7 million gallons of rum, distilled from the molasses of the West Indies slave plantations. 2 of the largest industries in America were shipbuilding and shipping, both creatures of the slave trade. Commerce with the slave colonies of not only England, but also Holland, Spain, and France, was vital to the young American economy. Eric Williams, Walter Rodney, and others have shown how European capitalism as a whole literally capitalized itself for industrialization and world empire out of African slavery. It is important to see that all classes of Euro-American settlers were equally involved in building a new bourgeois nation on the back of the African colonial proletariat. By the time of the Settler War of Independence, the African nation made up over 20% of the non-Indian population. 1 African colonial subject for every 4 settlers. African slaves, although heavily concentrated in the plantation colonies, were still represented throughout the settler territories. Their proportion in the non-Indian population ranged from 2 to 3% in Upper New England, to 8% in Rhode Island, to 14% in New York, and 41 and 60% respectively in Virginia and South Carolina. While they mainly labored as the agricultural proletariat, African labor played a crucial role in all the major trades and industries of the times. The colonized African nation, much more than the new Euro-American settler nation, was a complete nation. That is, possessing among its people a complete range of applied scientists, practical crafts, and productive labor. Both that colonized nation and the Indian nations were self-sufficient and economically whole, while the Euro-American invasion society was parasitic. While the class structure of the new African nation was still in a formative stage, distinct classes were visible within it well before the U.S. War of Independence. In Virginia, it appears that an overwhelming majority of the skilled workers, carpenters, ship pilots, coopers, blacksmiths, etc., were Africans. Nor was it just non-market production for direct use on the plantation. African artisans produced for the commercial market and were often hired out by their masters. For example, we know that George Washington was not only a planter, but also what we would call today a contractor, building structures for other planters with his gang of African slave carpenters. The profits were split between the father of our country and his slave overseer. The African presence in commerce and industry was widespread and all-pervasive, as one labor historian has summarized. Beginning of long quote. Some of the Africans who were brought to America in chains were skilled in wood carving, weaving, construction, and other crafts. In the South, black slaves were not only field hands. Many developed a variety of skills that were needed on a nearly self-sufficient plantation. Because skilled labor of whatever color was in great demand, slaves were often hired out to masters who owned shops by the day, month, or year for a stipulated amount. Some were hired out to shipmasters, serving as pilots and managers of ferries. Others were used in the maritime trades as ship caulkers, longshoremen, and sailmakers. A large number of slaves were employed in northern cities as house servants, sailors, sailmakers, and carpenters. New York had a higher proportion of skilled slaves than any other colony. Coopers, tailors, bakers, tanners, goldsmiths, cabinet makers, shoemakers, and glaziers. Both in Charleston and in the northern cities, many artisans utilized slave labor extensively. End of long quote. Africans were the landless, propertyless, permanent workers of the U.S. Empire. They were not just slaves. The African nation as a whole served as a proletariat for the Euro-American oppressor nation. This African colony supported on its shoulders the building of a Euro-American society more, quote, prosperous, more, quote, egalitarian, and yes, more, quote, democratic than any in semi-feudal old Europe. The Jeffersonian vision of America as a pastoral European democracy was rooted in the national life of small, independent white landowners. Such a society had no place of a proletariat within its ranks. Yet, in the age of capitalism, could not do without the labor of such a class. America imported a proletariat from Africa, a proletariat permanently chained in an internal colony, laboring for the benefit of all settlers. African workers might be individually owned, like tools and draft animals, by some settlers and not by others. But in their colonial subjugation, they were, as a whole, owned by the entire Euro-American nation. End of section.